How many people hold at least 10,000 XRP? This is a question I get on a daily basis. And before we get on December's update about XRP Rich List, I'm about to show you something every XRP holder needs to hear, because to this day, most holders have no idea where they stand on this ecosystem. And yes, I do get a lot of messages. A lot of you think you are small holders, but the reality is most XRP holders have no idea how early they are to this ecosystem. So let me break down the December XRP Rich List. And I promise you at the end of this video, you're never going to look at your XRP bags with the same eyes. Before we break down the numbers, I want you to imagine something quickly. Picture standing inside a massive stadium filled with tens of thousands of people. Then imagine someone taps you on the shoulder and tells you, by the way, everyone in this entire stadium combined doesn't even have what you have. Most XRP holders don't realize they're operating on that level. Most underestimate themselves simply because they compare their bags to whales who don't even represent real humans half the time. Exchanges, custodians, bots, institutions, not actual individual investors. But when we break down the December data, everything becomes clear. The entire XRP landscape looks nothing like people assume. Right now, in December 2025, there are about 7.3 million XRP wallets on Earth. That sounds like a huge number until you realize how misleading it actually is. Out of those 7.3 million wallets, only 737,000 wallets hold 2,300 XRP or more. That's already shocking because it means 90% of wallets barely hold anything at all. And here's where the perspective shift begins. The secret number for December, the number you need to be in the top 10% of all XRP wallets, is exactly 2,314 XRP. That's it. If you have that amount, you're already ahead of 6.5 million wallets worldwide. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this. I get messages from people panicking because they only have 2,000 XRP. They genuinely believe they are behind, when the truth is they are standing in front of the line while the rest of the world hasn't even stepped into the arena yet. And speaking of stepping into the arena, if you're serious about getting ahead of this next major financial shift, now is the time to upgrade your strategy. XRP Insiders Elite gives you exclusive access to private XRP alerts, the millionaire-level mindset that builds generational wealth, and the exact strategies top 1% holders quietly use. You also get full access to all premium resources. It's all linked in the video description, and use code millionaire for 10% off. Now let's keep going because the further you climb the XRP ladder, the more mind-blowing the numbers get. When we talk about the top 5% of XRP wallets, huge misconception again. People assume this means giant investors, but the data says otherwise. To be in the top 5%, you need roughly 8,000 XRP. That's it. With just 8,000 XRP, you leap into a level where 95% of all XRP wallets don't even come close. And yes, 8,000 XRP isn't what it used to be when prices were cheap. But with DCA, patience, and discipline, even someone starting small today can realistically climb into the top 5% wallet tier within a year. Most people underestimate what steady accumulation can do. They focus too much on the giant whales and not enough on how early they actually are. But let's go even deeper, because when we talk about the top 4% wallets, the numbers start revealing something far more powerful. The top 4% of all wallets represent about 295,000 wallets. But that number is incredibly deceptive. Why? Because when you strip away the noise, the exchange wallets, the custodial wallets, the automated bots, the OTC desks, and the addresses run by large institutions, the actual number of humans holding top-tier XRP bags shrinks dramatically. Once you remove these non-human wallets, we're not talking about 295,000 individuals anymore. Realistically, we're talking about roughly 100,000 humans on Earth who hold at least 10,000 XRP. And that number might be even lower when you factor in something barely anyone thinks about: multiple wallet addresses. Most serious XRP holders operate with multiple wallets. I personally have around 25 different wallet addresses. Many long-term holders do the same. That means the true number of humans with 10,000 plus XRP is likely far lower than 100,000. Think about that. On a planet with 8 billion people, only a tiny fraction, smaller than a football stadium, holds the type of XRP bag many people assume is small. When you zoom out globally, this is one of the most exclusive groups in the entire digital asset space. Now here's where perspective becomes everything. If you want to climb to the top 1% of XRP wallets, the number is 49.43 XRP. But even then, most wallets in the top 1%, 0.5%, and 0.1% aren't owned by single humans. They belong to entities with responsibilities, exchanges safeguarding customer funds, institutional custodians, market makers, OTC operations. The number of actual individual humans holding amounts that large, it is microscopic, it's almost non-existent. And this is exactly why I always say, you don't need 10,000 XRP to be early. You don't even need 5,000 XRP. You don't need to compare yourself to the largest holders because most of those holders aren't even people. What you do need is simple, a cold wallet, a strong mindset, and patience. Because if XRP hits $5 or $10 and you panic, sell your entire bag because it feels like a huge win in the moment, that's how you get priced out. The biggest risk in crypto isn't being small. The biggest risk is quitting early. The guy who had 300 BTC in 2011 thought he was small. The person who had only 10 Ethereum when EA was $5 felt behind. And yet history rewarded them not because they had the biggest bag, but because they held long enough, ignored the noise, and protected their assets. This is why I keep reminding people self-custody is everything. Not 20%, not 50%, 100%. Every major collapse in crypto exposes the same pattern. People who were early, smart, and positioned perfectly still got wiped out because their coins were sitting on centralized exchanges. MGO proved it, FTX proved it, and I don't want you repeating that mistake. You cannot call yourself early if you're not protecting what you have. If you want to survive the next 5 years in crypto, cold storage isn't optional. It's mandatory, because in 5 years, I genuinely believe XRP won't even be available on exchanges the way it is today. Between tokenization, institutional custody, private liquidity pools, and regulatory shifts, the landscape is changing fast. And by the time XRP is pushing 3-digit or 4-digit territory, the people who sold everything at $5 or $10 will be the same people who say, I used to have XRP, I should have never sold. What you need to understand is how human psychology plays a massive role in who actually benefits from these rare opportunities and who ends up looking back with regret. Because the biggest mistake most early investors make isn't miscalculating their bag size, it's miscalculating time. Most people are so focused on the price today that they can't see the structure forming behind the scenes. And with XRP, that structure is nothing like a traditional retail-driven asset. This is an infrastructure asset. This is the wiring system for global value transfer. But early holders often judge it like a meme coin because they expect sudden explosions instead of long-term positioning. Let's start by addressing the largest misconception people have, the belief that they're late simply because the price hasn't moved as fast as other assets. That belief is the single greatest reason people sell early. They assume slow equals dead, when in reality, slow often equals foundational. XRP isn't designed to be a speculative rocket, it's designed to be a global transaction engine. And every time you look at assets that eventually transformed into global infrastructure, the early phase always looks slow, boring, and disappointing until suddenly it didn't. Look at Amazon. For years, the chart moved sideways. Early holders felt like nothing was happening. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Amazon was building the system that would one day process half the e-commerce traffic of the entire world. The people who left early didn't lose because they were wrong. They lost because they didn't have the patience to let the structure finish developing. And every cycle, this pattern repeats. The early builders get mocked, the early holders get impatient, and the visionaries who understand the long game walk away with the reward. XRP today is in that exact phase. Large institutions are already positioning themselves quietly, without headlines, without hype, without retail attention. Tokenization pilots are increasing, cross-border settlement integrations are forming, regulatory clarity is converging, and yet retail investors still look at their portfolio and think, why hasn't it moved yet? That's like staring at a skyscraper foundation and asking why you can't live in the penthouse already. Another psychological trap is comparison. People constantly compare their XRP bag to the bags of others, not realizing the majority of large wallets aren't even human. Someone sees a wallet with 30 million XRP and feels tiny. They don't realize that wallet belongs to an exchange, not a person. They see a cluster of accounts with 500,000 XRP each and think, I'll never be that early. But what they don't see is that many of those accounts are managed by institutions that are simply holding for operational reasons, not investment. When you filter out all non-human wallets, the landscape looks completely different. Suddenly, the person with 1,000 XRP isn't tiny. They're already inside a group that dwarfs most of the world. But psychological pressure doesn't stop at comparison. It also shows up when price finally begins moving. The moment XRP hits something like $3 or $4 again, you will see people who spent years holding suddenly panic sell because it's the highest price they've ever seen. They think, I doubled my money, that's enough. They forget the entire reason they invested in the first place. They forget the data we're breaking down in this video. They forget the long-term structure because emotion takes over. The same thing happened with Bitcoin. The same thing happened with Ethereum. A massive percentage of early holders sold out before the real run even began. And this is why understanding where you stand in the ecosystem is so important. If you truly grasp how few people hold meaningful amounts of XRP, your patience becomes stronger because you realize the world hasn't caught on yet. Being early doesn't only mean buying early. It also means staying early long enough for the rest of the world to wake up. Now, let's talk about something even more important. What happens when the ecosystem matures? Because the next phase of XRP's evolution is not retail-driven. It's institution-driven. When tokenization scales, everyday users won't be the primary holders of large XRP amounts anymore. XRP will operate behind the scenes, powering systems that move trillions of dollars. Banks, payment providers, custodians, asset managers, and even governments will need XRP liquidity to settle tokenized value. That demand doesn't come from speculation, it comes from necessity. And once that happens, XRP holdings won't be measured in how many tokens someone bought, but in how much liquidity power they control. That's when the early holders who stayed through the quiet years finally understand what they were sitting on. Not because XRP suddenly becomes a lottery ticket, but because it becomes a key piece of global financial architecture. When you own a piece of a system like that, your value isn't determined by other retail traders. It's determined by institutions that need the asset to operate. This is why cold storage is everything. It's not about avoiding hacks. It's not about avoiding exchange failures. It's about preparing for a future where self-custody becomes the difference between being part of the new infrastructure or being priced out of it. As XRP becomes more institutionalized, exchanges will tighten, availability will shrink, and regulations will likely change how much liquidity even remains accessible to the public. This has already happened in other markets. When assets become systemically important, retail accessibility drops sharply. Just look at early internet domain names. In the 90s, anyone could buy them. People laughed at them. Then suddenly, as the internet matured, institutions absorbed the majority of premium domains. Today, owning a top-level domain isn't about luck. It's about controlling digital real estate. The people who held early gained massively because they simply didn't sell. XRP will follow a similar psychological path. You don't need to believe in hype. You just need to understand how markets behave when infrastructure becomes essential. Another factor most people overlook is how technological adoption curves work. Every major breakthrough in history goes through the same phases: innovation, early adoption, skepticism, consolidation, and then mass integration. XRP is currently in the consolidation stage, not price. Consolidation, institutional consolidation. Behind the scenes, pieces are being put into place very quietly. Financial systems don't broadcast what they're integrating until it's ready. They test, refine, scale, and then announce when the public impact is unavoidable. When that moment comes, retail sentiment shifts overnight. But the irony is that by the time retail sees the impact, the opportunity is already gone. The positioning is already decided, and the holders who stayed patient through the slow years are the ones who benefit the most. That's why the rich list matters, not because it tells you how rich the top holders are, but because it shows you how small the group of true early adopters actually is. A group that realistically fits inside a single stadium. Not a country, not a city, a single stadium of people holding meaningful amounts of a global settlement asset. This is not financial advice. The pattern is simple. Every major shift in financial history begins quietly, with a small minority positioning themselves before the rest of the world notices what's happening. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the early days of the internet, the first wave of mobile disruption, or the launch of Bitcoin itself. The people who win are always the ones who recognize that the silence before the storm is the most important phase of all. Right now, XRP is in that world-building phase. Not the hype phase, not the mania phase, not the media-driven price explosion phase, the world-building phase, the phase where the foundations of the next wave of value transfer are being laid brick by brick. And if you look closely, you see signs everywhere. Banks quietly expanding their digital asset teams, governments updating frameworks for cross-border payment rails, custodians preparing for tokenized finance, institutions partnering behind closed doors. And while retail traders argue on social media about price targets, the real architecture is being assembled in silence. This is how every large-scale technological shift begins, not with noise, but with quiet coordination. The next wave of XRP's growth will not come from millions of new retail buyers flooding the market like in the early Bitcoin era. It will come from utility, real utility, the kind of utility that forces adoption because there is simply no faster, cheaper, or more compliant way to move value across jurisdictions once tokenization becomes mainstream. XRP was designed for that moment. Liquidity delivery, settlement finality, throughput scaling, regulatory alignment, all of it points toward enterprise-grade usage. And when the shift happens, it won't be gradual, it will be sudden. Not because the technology suddenly changes, but because global systems tend to reach tipping points where the old rails can no longer support the volume of new digital assets being tokenized. When that tipping point hits, XRP transitions from crypto asset to infrastructure layer, and the people who already position themselves will be the ones standing in the right place at the right time. But here's where things get really interesting. The rich list becomes a roadmap for understanding what happens next. The distribution tells us that the overwhelming majority of wallets hold almost nothing. The mid-tiers, those with a few thousand to 10,000 XRP, represent the true early adopters. And the top 1% beyond that is filled mostly with entities, not individuals. This means the window where ordinary people can accumulate meaningful amounts of XRP is closing. Not because supply is running out today, but because as institutional adoption expands, liquidity tightens, availability shrinks, and retail access diminishes. Institutions don't just buy and sell, they lock assets up. They use them operationally. They need large quantities to service tokenized flows. When that happens, XRP moves off the open market and interlocked infrastructure systems, similar to how most of the world's gold is held in central bank vaults and never circulates. And this is exactly why early holders matter so much. A person with even 1,000 XRP could end up in a stronger position than they imagined simply because they got in before infrastructure demand grows exponentially. Once institutions begin absorbing supply, the rich list distribution changes forever. You won't see hundreds of thousands of small holders climbing the rankings. You'll see the top dominated by large entities and a rapidly shrinking pool of early adopters who held through the quiet years. This is why I keep stressing patience. XRP is not a meme with a 3-month lifespan. It is a multi-dead settlement asset in the making. The people who understand this don't measure success in weeks. They measure it by whether or not they were positioned before the world needed the asset. The next major shift will come in phases. First, tokenization goes mainstream. Real-world assets, institutional money markets, cross-border payments, and large-scale digital value instruments. Second, the institutions providing that infrastructure require fast, scalable settlement layers. Third, the liquidity pool provided by XRP becomes a necessity because traditional rails simply cannot handle the speed and cost efficiency required. Fourth, the supply available to retail shrinks significantly as institutions settle into their operational positions. This is the same pattern that played out with early commodities, early tech platforms, and early currency transitions. Retail gets the early opportunity. Institutional adoption absorbs the majority. The early holders who didn't sell out prematurely become the last remaining bridge between the two eras. And something else happens during this transition. Early holders often underestimate how powerful their position becomes once supply tightens. Most people believe the price catalyst will be hype, but in reality, the catalyst is liquidity compression. When the asset becomes essential to global settlement, every small amount becomes disproportionately valuable. This is why the rich list matters. It shows how little XRP is truly in the hands of actual individuals. And when the world needs something that only a few have, that is when generational wealth is created, not because of luck, but because of positioning. If you think about this from a historical perspective, every major financial transformation has rewarded the people who understood scarcity before the rest of the world recognized it. When the internet was new, domain names were everywhere, but only a handful of people realized premium names would become digital gold. When Bitcoin was new, coins were everywhere, but only a handful realized that halvingses would eventually squeeze supply. With XRP, the scarcity isn't technical, it's structural. Only a tiny fraction of humans actually hold enough XRP to matter in a settlement-driven future. And once enterprise usage expands, that fraction becomes even smaller. And this brings us to the core message. If you're holding XRP today, you're not late. You're early in a way that most people won't understand until the system flips. But being early isn't enough. You must protect your position, think long-term, stay consistent, and avoid the traps that wipe out early adopters in every cycle. You have a window that millions of people will wish they had, and that window will not stay open forever. And if you want the highest level strategies for positioning yourself before this transition becomes obvious, including private XRP alerts, deep dive research, long-term wealth frameworks, and the same mindset tools the smartest investors use to build generational wealth quietly behind the scenes, then joining XRP Insiders Elite is one of the strongest moves you can make. You'll get access to premium insights, private intelligence, and the system serious holders rely on to stay ahead of the curve. It's all linked in the video description, and you can use code Millionaire for 10%.